So today's talk for GED Social Sciences is looking at history after the Second World War, World War II. And this is a period where at the end of World War II, Europe and much of Asia too their economies have been destroyed by 6 years of war. Cities have been destroyed and economies have been decimated. At the same time, in America, the situation is a lot better. And America is really able to become the dominant world power. America, before the Second World War, had gone through a period of economic hardship, the Great Depression that we talked about. One thing that the Second World War did for the USA is bring an end to the Great Depression. There was no unemployment in the war. Everyone had a job. They were fighting or they were working in factories, building the necessary machinery and weapons in order to fight the war. The depression was solved. And with the end of the war, prosperity returns as people return to America and start to build their lives at a period of peace. The government of America helps that prosperity. They pass a law which gives people called the GI Bill. And what this did was provide financial assistance to men and women returning from the war. And that financial assistance would help them with education, with low interest loans to do things like buy their own homes, start businesses, and benefits for those that were unemployed. And that further helped the prosperity within the USA. When America looked across the rest of the world and saw how Europe was destroyed by this hideous 6-year battle, they realized that they needed to help Europe rebuild itself. And in order to help Europe rebuild itself, they loaned us billions of dollars. And the plan that they used to help rebuild Europe with these loans was called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is often you have questions about in GED. A lot of the history of the world at the end of World War II, from the end of World War II, is what's called the Cold War. And the Cold War was fought largely between the USA and Russia, or between capitalism and communism. China was not so involved. It was a little bit involved, but it was a battle between the USSR and the USA, which was really what the Cold War was about. In the Second World War, Russia and the USA were on the same side. As soon as the Second World War ended, the two went from being allies to becoming enemies. America wanted to be the number one world power. So did Russia, or as it became known, the Soviet Union. And I will help you with that distinction between the country Russia and the country the Soviet Union. What is the difference? What are these two? And I'll explain that. That's something you need to know for GED. The Soviet Union was communist, and their philosophy on life and on how government should run was based on the communist ethos. In contrast, in the USA, it was a capitalist ethos, and the two were completely the opposite. And so there was a fight for ideology. Would the world be run by a capitalist ideology or by a communist ideology? And as the Soviet Union's influence grew after World War II, other countries that came in under its fold became communist countries. There were a number of countries in Eastern Europe that became communist countries and came under the influence of the Soviet Union or the USSR. The USSR and the Soviet Union are the same thing. They are two different names for the same country. The USSR and Russia is not the same thing, and I will explain that difference in a moment. With the end of World War II, Germany was split into two. At the end of World War II, Germany was split into two different countries. In the last year or so of the war, as the Russian troops were advancing westwards towards Western Europe, and the Western European troops were advancing eastwards across Germany, the two got about halfway where they met at the end of the war when Germany surrendered. The western part, West Germany, came under the influence of the USA and Western Europe. East Germany, where the Russian soldiers had been, became part of East Germany, a separate communist country. And this, I said I would explain the difference between Russia and the USSR. So the USSR is actually a much bigger country than Russia. And I've got a list here, and it's difficult, I know, for you to see on the map. And the answer may be, go onto the internet, go to Google Maps, get a map of the world, and try and find these countries. Maybe take a picture of this slide and go and find these countries, and you'll see just how big this country, the Soviet Union or the USSR is. It is Russia and Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. They were all part of one country called the USSR. Now, as well as the USSR, there were the friends of the USSR, other countries in Eastern Europe that were communist, that came under the influence of the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc. And I don't know how clear these countries are for you, how easily you can see them, but we talked about Germany. So East Germany, there was a country called East Germany. That was in the Soviet bloc. Poland, Czechoslovakia, which is now two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. That used to just be one country called Czechoslovakia. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania were all in the Soviet bloc. So they were in that friendship group, and their armies all worked together as allies against the West. We'd never fought directly with each other, but we were always prepared to. And there was always a fear in the Western Europe that the Soviet Union and their allies, their armies would invade us, would attack us. This battle between the USA and Western Europe as their friends, between capitalism and the USSR, and to a lesser extent China, because China was also a communist country, for communism. What dominated American world politics after World War II was this fear about communism and communism spreading and trying to stop the spread of communism. That countries were encouraged to support either the USA or the USSR or China. Some countries were very clever about playing a game of never completely choosing one. And these countries were what are called non-aligned. So we were never quite sure whose side they were on. India was an example of one of those countries that was always very clever about being non-aligned, not getting into one particular camp. The the capitalism and communism fought each other through this idea, this Cold War. They didn't fight directly. There wasn't the USA and Russia didn't go to war directly with each other. They would fight each other through another country. So in the early 1950s, there was a war in Korea, the Korean War, which was a very bloody war, and millions of people died in it. And this is a war, and we now see Korea is split into two countries, North Korea and South Korea. This war in the early 50s was, will Korea be a capitalist country or a communist country? And what's actually happened as a result of that war is it was a stalemate. It's half communist in the north and it's half capitalist in the south. There was a war over communism in Vietnam in the 60s and early 70s. America lost that war and Vietnam became communist. There was a Cuban revolution where the people of Cuba rose up and Cuba became a communist country. There were a lot of wars in Africa and in South America where between the communists and the non-communists, and so often Russia, or occasionally China, but normally Russia would be supporting the communist side, and the USA would be fighting against the communist side. Russia had this group, or this Soviet bloc, which is sometimes called the Warsaw Pact, threatening what we would call the free world. And in Europe, we were very worried about this. There was a treaty, a military treaty between a number of these countries in the free West so we could all look after each other. And this was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more commonly known as NATO. So the US, Canada, and its European allies formed NATO so that we would have a united threat. We would be united against the threat that Russia would invade us, because certainly in the 1970s, I remember as a small boy, we were all terrified that Russia was going to invade Western Europe. The USA was now accepted as the world leading military power, and the European countries accepted that they would be the leaders of NATO. There was fear in Western Europe that Russia was going to invade. There was a particular fear in 1947 that Greece and Turkey could be invaded by Russia. A president called President Truman, had announced the Truman Doctrine. And that was that the US would protect countries that were threatened by communism. I talk about Germany being divided at the end of the Second World War, being divided into two countries. And you can see here on the map that an orange and a green Germany. Germany, which until the end of World War II was one country, became split. The orange became a country called West Germany, and the green became a country called East Germany. You will notice in the middle of East Germany that there is a little orange spot, with a blue arrow pointing towards it. That orange spot is West Berlin. When Germany was split into two countries, West Germany and East Germany, as Berlin was the capital of Germany, it was agreed that Berlin would be split into two as well. Berlin lies in the east of the country. So in the middle of East Germany, you have this little orange dot, which was West Berlin, that was part of the Orange country, the West Germany country. But Russia didn't like this orange spot in the middle of its communist East Germany. And so they thought that they would try to remove it by blockading it. They made it impossible for any supplies, lorries supplying food, water, and other things to get into that orange spot. And the only way that NATO could help the people living in West Germany was to airlift in and by aeroplane all of those goods that they needed. And this was known as the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift was successful, and in the end, it was agreed that West Berlin could remain part of West Germany, and it continued to do so all the way through the Cold War. The Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. So if we go back to this orange spot in the middle of the green, Berlin was half capitalist and half communist. To create the divide, the communists built a wall, and the wall stopped anyone from the West Berlin getting into East Berlin and vice versa. This was known as the Berlin Wall. It was a very strong, impregnable wall. If you tried to get over the wall, there were men with machine guns who would shoot you down before you got near the wall. There were many examples of people in East Germany, in East Berlin, who wanted to get to the West. The West is a much richer country, a much freer country, and a lot of people living under the communists were not happy living in poverty and with no freedom, and tried to escape, and many died trying to cross this wall. There wasn't just a barricade in Berlin. The communists built what's called the Iron Curtain. So this was huge fences. There were minefields. There were men in towers with machine guns. And it's called the Iron Curtain, but it was a barricade of walls, fences, minefields, men with machine guns, all across Germany. And if I go back to the map, all across between the orange and the green, to stop people crossing from one to the other. And if you tried to go through that fence, the electrified fence didn't kill you, if the minefields didn't kill you, there would be a machine gunner who would kill you to stop you getting over that fence and to create the barricade between communist East and capitalist West. While the West had NATO, in the East, they formed a group, an ally group as well, of communist countries known as the Warsaw Pact. And this was the group that was against NATO. The Soviet Union, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, which is now two separate countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. And here you can see the NATO countries in the blue, and you can see the Warsaw Pact, or the Soviet bloc countries, in red. While the battle of the superpowers between the USA and the USSR, and to a lesser extent China, was the most important part of the history at the end of the Second World War, the fight between capitalism and communism, Israel also was a part of history. And what's happening today between Israel and Gaza is obviously at the center of world news. But Israel as a state was created. 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis in the Second World War. And at the end of the Second World War, it was agreed that the state of Israel should be created, and this should be a place where the Jews could go and settle down in their homeland. But this homeland of Israel is not a country just for Jews. There were Palestinians there. There were Muslims, Christians, many of whom had been living there for thousands of years. But the creation of the state of Israel has created and continues to create a lot of problems as between the Israelis and the other countries that surround it, and also the Palestinians that live in Israel as well. Now let's move on to what's happening within America. We're talking about the world outside the USA at the end of World War II. We did talk briefly about the prosperity that America had at the end of the Second World War. But with America showing themselves as the leaders of the free world, how free inside was America, really? And when you look at it more closely, the picture isn't entirely beautiful. There was racism, continued to exist in America, sexism, and also ageism. Racism first. Ever since the Civil War was won by the Union. The Civil War was a war over slavery, and the Civil War was meant to the winning of the Civil War by the Union was meant to bring freedom and equality to the African American slaves. But here we are 100 years later, and it's still there, particularly in the south of the USA. The Jim Crow laws. These were laws that were passed in the late 19th century, and the name Jim Crow comes from it's a derogatory nickname for an African American. And what these laws were laws that allowed society to impose racist restrictions on African Americans. These laws said things like, black people cannot use these toilets, only white people. They cannot sit in this part of the bus. They have to sit in a separate area. They can't live in this part of town. They can't go to the same schools. No, well, they can't. We can't have interracial marriage. They can only vote if they're good enough at reading and writing. Otherwise, we won't give them the right to vote. And this was still happening after the end of the Second World War. Not all across America, but in the South. Remember, if you go back to the Civil War was about slavery. And the Civil War was really about the northern states that were anti-slavery, fighting the southern states where slavery on the plantations was a very important part of life. But even after the end of the Second World War, in those southern states, there was still a lot of racist problems. After World War II, a civil rights movement started. So this was African Americans themselves saying, look, America, you say that you are the leaders of the free world and that you see this need to fight the evil of communism. But look at your own country. Look at how you're running your own country. Look at how you're treating us. Is that free? The Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, did rule against this segregation of schools. In 1954, they said, you cannot say that people can't come to your school simply because they are of the wrong race. There was the Civil Rights Act in 1964 giving these rights. There was a Voting Rights Act in 1965 which outlawed racial discrimination and voting restrictions. So in time, America started to address these issues of racism in the country. But the way these laws were interpreted and obeyed depended very much of where in the USA you were talking about. And in some parts of the USA, and you won't be surprised to know that many of these parts of the USA were parts in the south of the USA, the areas that in the Civil War time were areas where they wanted slavery to continue. These were the areas where racism continued. As a result of some of these states ignoring these new laws, the African Americans felt that they needed to protest themselves through non-violent protests and through civil disobedience. I've got here, and you might want to take a picture of it so you can watch these YouTube videos if you want to. But I've got 3 YouTube videos here. One about Rosa Parks in 1955. Rosa Parks was a leader of a female leader of the civil rights movement. The second video, the Little Rock 9. These were 9 children who wanted to go to high school in America in a town called Little Rock. In 1957, they were forbidden from going to the high school because they were African Americans, and the school said that African Americans were not welcome at their school. And the final video is a video of Martin Luther King. He's probably the main leader of the civil rights movement, and he was assassinated in 1968. And here we've got pictures of first Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is most famous because she was sitting on a bus, and in Alabama, in the south of the USA, and the bus was crowded, and there was a white man on the bus who didn't have a seat. The bus driver told Rosa Parks to stand up and give her seat to the white man. She refused, and as a result of refusing to give her seat to a white man, she was sent to prison. The Little Rock 9. I don't know how clear this picture is for you, but here is a picture of one of the girls of the Little Rock 9 walking to school. Originally, the school said, you cannot come to our school, you 9 black African American children, because African Americans are not welcome at our school. The president overruled that decision, and the school had to accept them. But you can see here that while this girl is walking into school, all these people behind her shouting horrible, and I'm sure it's horrible things they're shouting at her because they did not welcome her coming to their school. This was 1957. This is not that long ago. And lastly, Martin Luther King. Here's a picture of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a Baptist Christian minister and leader of the civil rights movement. And he was assassinated in 1968. I said talked about three kinds of discrimination: racist, sexist, and ageist. Um, Women were given the vote after the end of the First World War, 1919, with the 19th Amendment. But while they had the right to vote, they didn't have full equality. There were some jobs that they were not allowed to do. If a woman was doing a job in an office sitting next to a man doing exactly the same job, very likely that man would be paid a lot more than the woman simply because he's a man. And women also fought for their own rights. Things did improve with better employment rights due to their campaigning. And also in 1973, abortion was legalized. And I will talk about ageism, this idea of the young wanting more say in life. We'll see that because it's really with the Vietnam War that this comes to the fore. But let me talk about ageism later. America, the biggest part of in terms of world history after World War II, is this fight between capitalism and communism, between the USA and Russia, and to a lesser extent China. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961, the Russians place the Soviet Union place some of their nuclear missiles in Cuba. Cuba is an island in the Caribbean, very near the USA. And the Russians put some of their powerful nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles, on that island so that they can easily be fired from the island of Cuba into the USA. When the USA discover that this is what the Russians have done, it causes a huge international crisis. And there is a great fear that it will lead to nuclear war between the USA and Russia. And for 13 days, the world is on tenterhooks as to what will happen. How will this crisis be solved? Finally, the USSR agree to remove the missiles, but in return, there are US missiles in NATO in Turkey. And Turkey is a country in Eastern Europe, very near the USSR. So these missiles in Turkey were threatening the USSR in the same way that the USSR missiles were in Cuba. And that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1961, is all about. The president at the time, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated in 1963. He was not assassinated by communists. He was assassinated by an individual. And we don't know the reason, but maybe this was an individual who was not completely of sound mind. We then had Lyndon Johnson. And this is the president that was behind the Civil Rights Act that we talked about a while back. And Lyndon Johnson was keen to create what he called a great society, a society where there would be an end to poverty. 1965, the Americans enters the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, like so many of these wars at the end of after the Second World War, was a war between capitalism and communism. You had in Vietnam the fear of the spread of communism, and despite the fact that the leader in at the time, the Vietnamese leaders at the time that the Americans supported were not necessarily the most glowing examples of good leadership. Because they were anti-communist, they got the support of the USA. And this started a long, bloody war that the USA finally lost. Here is John F. Kennedy sitting with his wife, and that is 1 second before he is shot. 1963. The Vietnam War that started in 1965 lasted for 8 years. Nearly 60,000 US troops were killed and over 300,000 were injured. And they lost. The Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese army, ended up being victorious. The war, in which so many US troops were killed and injured, required huge numbers of soldiers. And the only way that the US could provide the number of soldiers necessary to fight in this war was to force young people to go to war and fighting in the US Army. Young people didn't want to go and fight in Vietnam. They didn't understand, what is this war about? Why are we fighting there? Why should I fight? They didn't want to. The war became very unpopular. And young people, this is where what we're talking about, the third kind of, we talked about racism, we've talked about sexism, and this was ageism. Young people saying, I'm fed up with old people telling me what to do. Why should I go to this country that I know nothing about and fight in a war where I'm very likely to be killed or injured? And that created another revolution. At the same time that we had the young being forced to go to Vietnam and rebelling, it was the same as it was the same time as the rise of rock and roll music, and this started a revolution of young against old. The US troops did not always behave brilliantly in Vietnam. And here is an example that you will probably not be asked questions about in your GED exam, but I want you to know about it. Because while as a Brit, I am perhaps I'm very much on the side of what I would call the free world against communism, that there are times where we have behaved really badly and we should be ashamed of it. And here in America, there's an example, the Ma Lai massacre in 1968, where US troops massacred about 500 Vietnamese civilians. The fact that the US had a free press and that there were journalists in Vietnam meant that some of these atrocities were shown, people learned about them. And this created more of this feeling of unpopularity about the war. Why are we fighting this war? Are we really on the side of good? And people didn't want to fight in it. Young people were against the war. And you can see here, young people protesting. This feeling was not just in America, in Europe also. There was this feeling of young people feeling that actually the old in our society, the old men in our society are making too many of the decisions, and we want to have more of a say in our future. Sex and drugs and rock and roll. Any way to annoy your parents was seen as a good way to behave. I am a child of the 60s. I'm a little bit too young to have been involved in this revolution, but this was a revolution where the young decided that they would not get their hair cut short. That's what soldiers do. They would wear unusual clothes. They became sexually much more promiscuous. They took drugs. They listened to loud rock and roll music. They did everything they could to annoy their parents as part of this revolution. There were also very violent protests, not just in America, but in Europe too. London and Paris saw huge violent protests of young people simply protesting because they wanted to have more of a say in how society was run, and not to have to always listen to what the old men of their society believed. President Nixon. President Nixon was finally the president that withdrew the troops from Vietnam, which was the right thing to do. But don't for a moment think that Nixon was a good president. It took him many years to withdraw the troops. But Nixon was actually famous for a scandal called the Watergate scandal. And this Watergate scandal actually led to him having to resign as president. In an election where President Nixon, who was a Republican, he was the candidate for the Republican Party, and he was fighting against the Democrats, which is what typically in America there are two parties, Republicans and Democrats. When President Nixon was fighting to become president for the Republicans, he cheated. He sent burglars to the Democratic headquarters so he could steal information about what they were going to campaign about, what they were going to do. But they were caught. And when it became clear that Nixon had been guilty of this, he had to resign as president. After Nixon, we had an interim president called Ford for a couple of years. But then we had President Carter, who was a Democrat. Under President Carter, the Cold War continued. There were Arab-Israeli wars. There was an oil crisis. In 1979, another problem hit the world, which was a revolution in Iran. Iran was a country that had a king, and the king in Iran was called a Shah. The Shah was very unpopular in Iran. The people felt that the Shah was corrupt and didn't look after the needs of the poor. He was thrown out of the country, and the people welcomed a new leader, a religious leader called Ayatollah Khomeini. While the religious leaders in Iran are very unpopular today, during the revolution in 1979, he was welcomed into the country by the people. And the US was seen as the big enemy because the US had supported this corrupt Shah. The new government took over the US embassy and they kidnapped the diplomats, the US diplomats that were in the embassy, and held them hostage for 444 days. The Americans tried to rescue them, but failed. The US was seen as weak. Russia looked to be getting the upper hand. Here's a picture of a hostage, blindfold. People in America saw these pictures and they saw that America was not able to do anything about it. They were not able to rescue these people. They were not strong enough to rescue these people. America felt weak. As a result, President Carter, perhaps unfairly for many reasons, was not seen as a good, strong president. In 1980, a new president, President Reagan, was elected. During his presidency, a lot changed. Taxes were lowered. Regulations on industry were reduced to help the American economy. Military spending was increased. and their foreign policy became much more aggressive and anti-communist. At the same time, in the UK had a prime minister that was also very aggressively anti-communist and pro-business, Margaret Thatcher. This aggressive anti-communist stance in the end worked, while we had Reagan and Thatcher in the West. In Russia, the Russians actually became much less aggressive, and in the end, we had a President Gorbachev who actually was keener on the idea of freedoms in Russia and saw the problems of Russia. The economies of Europe and the US were performing a lot better than Russia, or I should call it, I must stop calling it Russia, the Soviet Union or the USSR. Life in the USSR, life in Eastern Europe was tough. Under communism, these economies really struggled to grow, whereas in Europe, life was flourishing. And in the end, I don't know if it's the strength of the West that ended communism, or the fact that communism in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe just didn't work. But in 1989, the Cold War ended. The communist system in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet bloc came to an end. And the biggest demonstration of that was we saw revolutions in places like Poland and Romania, where the people rose up against these, what they saw as evil rulers. And the Berlin Wall came down. The Berlin Wall was destroyed by people themselves, arriving with pickaxes, or even with their bare hands to take down a wall that they had begun to hate. And the end of the Berlin Wall was a time of massive celebration, that freedom had returned. And these decades of both sides fearing the other, both sides fearing the beginning of nuclear war, came to an end. It was a very happy time. Very sad to see today that we have America and Russia back into a Cold War situation. Then, in the early 90s, we saw a new president, President Bill Clinton, and this was a period. This period of the 90s was a great period for the economy and for prosperity of people in America and in Europe. The USA signed a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, which allowed the three countries to trade with each other without barriers. And this helped all three countries to grow further. With the end of the threat of the Soviet Union and communism taking over Western Europe, as always, a new threat arrived. And that new threat came from Al-Qaeda and other Islamic extremists. And these were fearing, or they grew up from people in the Islamic world fearing that America, that Israel, and Israel together were interfering in the Middle East, in Islam. They wanted the end of Israel. They wanted the end of US influence in their Islamic part of the world. And this began a new threat which continues today, the threat of Islamic extremism. Now we've got to 2000. Let's go through some of the questions. And remember, the important part of the talk is not remembering dates and remembering everybody's name. It's just understanding the situation. So when you get given a speech, you go, oh yes, this must be about the Vietnam War. Yes, that I remember a little bit about the Vietnam War, so that you understand it. So here we've got a speech, and this is a speech from on the Marshall Plan. That should say excerpt from a speech on the Marshall Plan by Secretary of State George Marshall, 1947. You might remember the Marshall Plan was the plan where America thought, well, we need to rescue. The world looks pretty sick at the end of World War II. We need to rescue them. So we're going to have a plan where we're going to lend lots of money so these economies can rebuild themselves. Not just our allies, but everyone, because Germany needs it too. So let's go through this. Let's go through the question. Have a look at the questions. Then we'll go back to the speech. We'll read through the speech carefully and then see if we can answer the questions. In this talk, I've got quite a lot of questions actually. But anyway, let's see what question 1 and 2 are before we read the speech. So question 1, based on the speech, you can infer that Marshall. So what did Marshall want? He wanted defeated Germany and Japan to pay for global economic recovery after World War II. B, thought that the US should play a leading role in global economic recovery after World War II. C, favoured letting European allies solve their own economic problems. Or D, believed that only allies of the US deserved to receive economic aid. Now, what I might do is I might look at that and say, well, from what I know of the Marshall Plan was, well, at the end of the Second World War, America thinks to themselves, well, you know, we really need to rescue the world. We have this situation where Europe looks in a really bad state, and we need to do our bit and to help. So wanted defeated Germany and Japan to pay for global economic recovery. That doesn't sound to me like, and I'm just going to put a light on. That doesn't sound to me like Marshall Plan, but we'll see when we read the speech. Thought that the US should play a leading role in global economic recovery after World War II. Well, that sounds exactly what the Marshall Plan was about. But let's see. Let's look at the other 3 and let's read the speech. Now I might look at C. Favoured letting European allies solve their own economic problems. Well, no, that's exactly what the Marshall Plan wasn't. It was saying we need to help. Or D, believed that only allies of the US deserved to receive economic aid. Well, actually, from what I remember of the Marshall Plan, it was about helping everyone, Germany included. So I think it's probably going to be B, and I haven't even read it, but let's go back and see. And now let's look at question 2. Secretary of State Marshall would most likely agree with which of the following statements? The US should take no further part in international affairs, A. B, the biggest threat to stability in Europe is political parties that promote democracy. C, prosperity is possible only under conditions of political and social stability. Or D, efforts to aid post-war economic recovery should focus only on US allies. Okay, so going through this, the US should take no further part in international affairs. Well, from what I know of the Marshall Plan, it's the opposite. It's America recognizing that they need to help the world. So A looks very unlikely. B, the biggest threat to stability in Europe is political parties that promote democracy. Well, I think that's very unlikely because America doesn't see democracy as a threat. America loves democracy. So political parties that promote democracy is something that Secretary of State Marshall I would not see as a threat. So I think it's very unlikely to be B. Prosperity is possible only under conditions of political and social stability. Well, that sounds very possible, because that's exactly the kind of thing that Secretary of State Marshall would probably agree with. You need to create a stable political conditions in order to prosper. Efforts to aid post-war economic recovery should focus only on US allies. Not sure. Let's go back to it. And let's go back and let's go through the reading. Oh, sorry. Right, I'm going to read this through slowly. The modern system of, so this is from 1947, an excerpt from a speech. The modern system of the division of labour upon which the exchange of products is based is in danger of breaking down. Aside from the demoralizing effect on the world at large and the possibilities of disturbances arising as a result of the desperation of the people concerned, the consequences to the economy of the United States should be apparent to all. It is logical. So what he's saying is that there's a degree of chaos out there at the end of World War II. And people are so desperate that they could do crazy things. And when people are desperate and do crazy things, it's not just bad for those countries. It has consequences to the economy of the United States, should be apparent to all. It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. So America feels it's their duty to try to create peace and stability in the world. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine. So this is not about one country versus another, or this doctrine, capitalism versus communism. But their policy is against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. So they're trying to make the world a better place. This is not about politics. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. So there's the speech. Now let's go back to these questions again. Based on the speech, you can infer that Marshall, A, wanted defeated Germany and Japan to pay for global economic recovery after World War II. He never said that. Indeed, he said, he doesn't care whether you're your friend or enemy. This is about sorting the world out. So A is wrong. B, thought that the US should play a leading role in global economic recovery after World War II. Well, I'm pretty sure it is B. We'll check the other two, because he does talk about feeling that the US has got this role that they need to play. C, favoured letting European allies solve their own economic problems. Well, he actually said the opposite. He said we need to do our bit to stop the chaos. D, believe that only allies of the US deserve to receive economic aid. Well, he said absolutely the opposite of that. So the answer to question 1 is B. And question 2, A, the US should take no further part in international affairs. Which one of these Secretary of State would most likely agree with? Which of the following statements? Well, I think A, he certainly would not agree with, because he's actually explicitly saying in the speech that the US needs to play a big role in the world now. They need us. B, the biggest threat to stability in Europe is political parties that promote democracy. Well, he doesn't say that at all, so we know it's not B. C, prosperity is possible only under conditions of political and social stability. Well, he definitely say that because what he's really worried about is because of political and social instability, you could get real chaos, and that what America needs to do to restore prosperity in the world is to provide some of this stability. A D, efforts to aid post-war economic recovery should focus only on US allies. Well, actually, he has said that this is all about, his fight is not against different countries, it's against hunger. So that is that. So I think that it's not D, I think it's C. Now let's go on to questions 3 to 8. And again, this is a speech that you're going to be interpreting. And this is a speech from Dr. Martin Luther King. And we saw his picture, the civil rights movement leader. So the civil rights movement leader, he's saying, hey, you America, you're saying to the world that you are the leader of the free world and you claim to have all these beliefs about freedom. Well, look how you're treating African Americans in many parts of America. You're not treating them well. And we need rights, we need equality across America. And this is his famous speech. It's called I Have a Dream. And this is a part of it. Let's look at the questions and then let's go through the speech. There are quite a few questions here. So this looks like there's 6 questions here. So let's go through them. Question 3, what problem was Dr. Martin Luther King trying to highlight? The problem of sexual harassment for females in the US, the problem of racial inequality for African Americans in the US, the problem of income inequality for the very poor compared to the top 1%, or D, the problem of having unrealistic dreams and how to eliminate them. From what I know of Dr. Martin Luther King, I know that he's a civil rights movement leader and he's trying to get equal rights for African Americans in the US. So when I would look at those 4, I might be wrong, but my suspicion would be it's going to be B, because the B is all about racial inequality for African Americans. And that's what he's about. It could be wrong. It could be a trick question. It could be a difficult question, but that's where I'm thinking before I've even read the speech. So from what I know, when I see that name, Martin Luther King, I'll think civil rights movement leader after the Second World War. And what Martin Luther King was fussed about was equal rights for African Americans. Question 4, again on the same speech. According to Dr. King's speech in 1963, African Americans were discriminated against in each of the following ways except, so one of these is not true, the other 3 are. They were often victims of police brutality. They were not allowed to stay in white-only hotels. They could not get good reception for their mobile phones in the large ghettos. Or D, they were still denied the right to vote in some parts of the country. But when I look at that, I have not read the speech yet, but from what I know of 1963 and of the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. King, was all about racial inequality in America, that police brutality, that's very likely to be a form of discrimination. We still see signs of it today. They were not allowed to stay in white-only hotels. Well, we know that there was segregation in America. So B, that sounds like quite a sounds like quite a likely form of discrimination. C, they could not get good reception for their mobile phones in the large ghettos. That sounds a bit ridiculous because in 1963, you didn't have mobile phones. So I'm pretty sure it's going to be C, and I haven't even read the speech. Or D, they were still denied the right to vote in some parts of the country. Well, that sounds very likely. So do you see how a little bit of knowledge about who is Martin Luther King? What kind of racial discrimination was there in America at this time? You can get to the right answer without actually going through the speech. Now, you should read the speech and check on your answer, but it gives you a good chance to get the right answer, an even better chance to get the right answer with a bit of knowledge. Question number 5. Towards the end of his speech, Dr. King used the quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." So he's taken this quote from the Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," taken from the Declaration of Independence. Why did Dr. King include this quote in his speech? Now, I think this might be a difficult question for some of you, because you really have to understand how he's thinking. Is he A, pointing out the differences between the rights of men and the rights of women? But when they talk about all men are created equal, I think they mean men as a case of the species, men and women. So I'm not sure that it's A, but we'll see. B, he was trying to convince the audience that African Americans are superior to white Americans and should be treated as such. I don't think he's saying that they're superior. He's trying to convince the audience that they are equal, not superior. They are equal. He wanted African Americans to declare their independence from the US. Well, I don't think it's that, because remember that Dr. Martin Luther King is about civil rights. He's about equality. He wasn't saying that he wanted independence from the United States. He wanted them to be treated equal. So I'd be quite surprised if it's C. Or D, he wanted to point out the hypocrisy of people who agree with the Declaration of Independence but don't agree with equal rights for African Americans. So you're a hypocrite if you say, "I believe that everyone should be treated equally," and then you don't treat your maid equally, or you don't treat your daughter the same way that you treat your son, but you say that you're in favor of equality. You're being a hypocrite if you claim to be one thing, but actually you don't practice it. So I think it's D. He's saying America pretends that they are the land of the free. They believe in all these things. They believe in equality. If they believe that men are created equal, that they should be treated equally, how come in the US that African Americans are not treated equally? So I think before I've even read the speech, it's going to be D. Do you see how I'm using the fact that I've got a little bit of knowledge to help me with these questions before I've even read the speech? I'm going to read the speech because I might be wrong, but just to confirm my suspicions. Dr. Martin Luther King also led many protests for civil rights during this period of history. What does the term civil rights mean in this context? The rights and freedoms that every citizen has always enjoyed equally. A. B. The rights and freedoms that only American Africans have always benefited from. The rights and freedoms that ensure every citizen's ability to participate equally in social and political life. Or D. The rights and freedoms required by state law, not federal law. So the rights and freedoms that every citizen has always enjoyed equally. Well, it sounds wrong to me, because Martin Luther King is saying no, but African Americans have never enjoyed these equal rights. B, the rights and freedoms that only African Americans have always benefited from. Well, we're talking about the fact that they haven't, the rights that they haven't benefited from. So I don't think it's B. C, the rights and freedoms that ensure every citizen's ability to participate equally in social and political life. That looks like that's what civil rights is about. It's C. Or D, the rights and freedoms required by state law, but not. This is not about the difference between state and federal law. It's about people's rights. So I don't think it's D. I think it's C. This is quite a difficult question because it requires a knowledge of English grammar to see the differences between what each of these three are saying. This is a difficult question, but we'll go through the speech and get to the answer. But my hunch is it's C. Question number 7. Dr. Martin Luther King was eventually successful in helping to bring an end to racial segregation in the United States. Which of the following best describes racial segregation? The separation of different races in public institutions and daily life. B, a belief that the United States Constitution should apply only to the right kind of people. C, the system that helps include more minorities in everyday events. Or D, a scientific theory that supports the ideas and beliefs of white supremacists. Okay, racial segregation. Segregating, you're saying, okay, you're separating people depending on their race. A separation of different races, that sounds a bit like it. In public institutions and daily life. That sounds to me like exactly what racial segregation is. But let's see at the end, let's go back to it after we've read the speech. A belief that the US Constitution should apply only to the... No, the US Constitution doesn't talk about racial segregation. C, the system that helps include more minority... Well, actually, it's the opposite. C is the opposite of racial segregation. Or D, a scientific theory. It's not a scientific theory. So I think it's probably A, but let's see. Now let's look at question 8. Every decade, the United States Census Bureau takes a census of the population. Which of the following best describes the US Census? A, the census of the population. Look at that. A calculation is based on global warming. Well, no, it's a census of the population. So I don't think it's A. B, an unconstitutional practice that should be stopped immediately. And no, that's not what it says. C, demographic information such as age, ethnicity, and level of education taken every 10 years. That sounds a bit like it, but let's see afterwards. Or D, a tax that every citizen needs to pay. It's not a tax, it's a census of the population. It takes a census. So I think it's probably C. Let's go back to the speech. I'm sorry this talk is taking so long. As we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. A Negro is a term for a black man. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating, "For whites only." We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, no, we are not satisfied. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Right, let's go back to the questions. And again, I'm sorry this is taking so long. Question 3, what problem was he trying to highlight? Well, a problem of sexual harassment for females. Doesn't talk about that anywhere in the speech. The problem of racial inequality for African Americans. Well, I think that's exactly what Martin Luther King was talking about. But let's just check the other two. The problem of income inequality for the very poor compared to the top 1%. He never mentions it. The problem of having unrealistic dreams and how to eliminate them. He certainly talks about dreams, but he talks about a dream that he has that he thinks really is realistic and he wants it to happen. This dream that America will one day be equal. It's not really a dream, it's a hope, it's a belief, it's a determination that this is going to happen. So I don't think it's D, it's B. The problem of racial inequality for African Americans in the United States, Negroes. Question 4. According to Dr. King's speech in 1963, African Americans were discriminated against in each of the following ways except they were often victims of police brutality. They were not allowed to stay in white-only hotels. Well, those are both mentioned. They could not get reception for their mobile phones in the large ghettos. He certainly talks about ghettos, but he never talks about mobile phones because they weren't invented in those days. They were still denied the right to vote in some parts of the country. So in Mississippi, they couldn't vote. In New York, they could, but they thought, what's the point? Question 5. Towards the end of his speech, Dr. King used the quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that more men are created equal," taken from the Declaration of Independence. Why did Dr. King include this quote in his speech? Nothing to do with men and women. He's not talking about sexism, which was an issue. He's talking about racial inequality. He was trying to convince the audience that African Americans are superior. No, he's talking about equality, equal. He wanted African Americans to declare independence from the United States. No. He has a dream of everyone remaining together, but equal in a life of equality. Or D, he wanted to point out the hypocrisy of people who agree with the Declaration of Independence, but don't agree with equal rights for African Americans. So here are all these people in America who are have this love for this Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the American way, the land of the free. But at the same time, they are happy that African Americans are not given equal rights. It's hypocrisy. So it's D. Question 6. Dr. Martin Luther King also led many protests for civil rights during this period of history. What does the term civil rights mean in this context? This is a difficult one. This is testing your knowledge of English, and this is a really sophisticated knowledge of English grammar and exactly what these 4 things are saying. So the rights and freedoms that every citizen has always enjoyed equally. Well, it's not that they have, it's what they should, that people should be free. They haven't always enjoyed it, so it's not A. It sounds like it could be A, but it's not. B, the rights and freedoms that only African Americans have always benefited from. No, civil rights is they want to get equal rights. So it's not B. C, the rights and freedoms that ensure every citizen's ability to participate equally in social and political life. So that sounds to me like civil rights. That's what it's all about. It's about the fact that citizens should have rights and freedoms to and they should be all be created equally. It doesn't matter what your race is. It doesn't matter what your sex is. That you should all have the same rights in social and political life. So it sounds like C, but let's check D. D, the rights and freedoms required by state law, but not federal law. Again, there's nothing. Civil rights has got nothing to do with the difference of state or federal, so it's not D. So the answer to question 6 is C. Question 7. Dr. Martin Luther King was eventually successful in helping to bring an end to racial segregation in the US. Which of the following best describes racial segregation? The separation of different races in public institutions and daily life. That sounds like it. So you can see this question it's less what's in the speech, it's understanding. It's understanding what this particular form of racism is. What does it mean? The separation of different races in public institutions and daily life. That sounds to me very like what I would call racial segregation, but I'm going to check the other 3 answers. A belief that the US Constitution should apply only to the right kind of people. Well, it's not B. C, a system that helps include more minorities in everyday events. Well, it's the opposite of C. Or D, a scientific theory that supports the ideas and beliefs of white supremacists. It's not a theory. It's A, it's a separation of different races in public institutions and daily life. That's what racial segregation is. And question number 8. Every decade, the United States Census Bureau takes a census of the population. Which of the following best describes the US Census? A, calculations based on global warming. B, an unconstitutional practice that should be stopped immediately. Well, neither of those two sound like that it's a census of the population. D, demographic information such as age, ethnicity, and level of education taken every 10 years. Demographics is all about of the people, of the population. So I think it's C, but let's just check D. D, a tax that every citizen needs to pay every 10 years. Well, the census has got nothing to do with a tax. It's got to do with a checking out of the population. Now let's go on to question number 9. In October 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union faced a 13-day standoff known as the Cuban Missile Crisis after the United States discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles away from the continental United States. President Kennedy ordered an immediate naval blockade of Cuba and warned the American people that he was willing to use whatever force necessary to neutralize this threat to national security. The standoff ended when? So we did the Cuban Missile Crisis, and A, the USSR revealed that the nuclear missiles in Cuba were actually fakes. Well, that isn't what happened. B, the United States backed down and decided to allow the missiles to remain in Cuba. Well, if you remember from the Cuban Missile Crisis, that isn't what happened either. C, President JFK was able to get the Soviet Union to withdraw its missiles from Cuba while the United States agreed to remove nuclear missiles from Turkey. Well, that sounds like what happened, but let's just check. D, the USSR negotiated a treaty with the United States to keep the missiles in place without the threat of them ever being used. Well, that isn't what happened. It's C. And so you'd have to think, oh yes, Cuban Missile Crisis, that's when the Russians put their missiles were very near America, and there was a big standoff, and in the end the Russians took them away because the Americans said that they'd take some of theirs away. So well done. I'm sorry this has taken an hour and a half. We've got one more talk to go, which is history after the year 2000. One more history talk to go. Then we will need to go through the US Constitution, we'll need to go through geography and economics and some more current affairs.